Welcome to the Celebration Church Orlando podcast. Thank you for joining us. To learn more about Celebration Orlando, a church devoted to reaching the lost, equipping the found, and helping the hurting, follow us on social media using the handle @CelebrationORL or visit our website, celebrationorl.org.
We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming to bring you live Tropical Storm Debbie updates.
Yes, we're going to be here for 24 hours. We're going to be your go-to place to get all updates on all things storm-related.
Anywho, this is the Celebration Church Orlando podcast. And if you stumbled along this podcast, this is a segment we like to call After the Message. Whether you're watching on YouTube or now you can watch on Spotify. How about that?
We're moving forward.
We are.
Yeah.
We are. We've cultivated the ground. We've cornered an area of the market.
Yes.
And here we are on Spotify.
Harvest.
Hopefully we're watching on Spotify and I didn't just make more work for us, but so glad that you're with us for a new season of After the Message. This is a segment that just helps us continue the conversation from the previous Sunday's sermon, and I'm joined by the lead pastor of Celebration Orlando, Pastor Keith. How are you?
I'm great, man.
Yeah.
I'm great. I'm excited to be here, excited for the season that we're launching with After the Message. I'm glad to be sitting here with you, and I love continuing the conversation in this format because I think it just allows us to explore in ways that sometimes the platform doesn't allow us to.
Very true.
Yeah.
And you even mentioned our setup here. You're pleased with the actual seats that we're sitting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. If you guys are been around the After the Message community, we're going to call them a community.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a group. It's like 8 of them out there that are waiting for our next episode to drop. But if you're part of our After the Message community, then you know that we've grown and we have been in different spaces. And the last setting was we had tables between us, and we're moving closer to like this format. So I love this. This is our first time in this format, and it fits me right, man. It's a vibe, as you know, is our phrase around here.
That's right. It's a vibe. At this point of our church history, if you will, we are in a new series called Corinth, a much anticipated series for you personally.
Yes.
I believe that would be fair to say, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so bringing with Corinth are some additional elements that we don't typically do with every sermon series that we have at Celebration Church Orlando. One of those additional elements being After the Message podcast that we're doing right here.
Let's go.
We are partnering with Right Now Media, and we're doing a study, a Jenny Allen study that's going along with that. So maybe you watch from afar and you want to get more information about how to connect with us on that extra element. You can just reach out to us, social media, email, whatever.
It's free to sign up.
We can give you access to Right Now Media.
Yep.
And I hope they're not mad at me for blasting that all over the internet. And we're also, if you're with us on Sundays, I don't know if we ran out of journals or not, but we bought some journals for the church.
Yeah, I just got an update from Pastor Lindsay. We're definitely in scarcity mode right now. There's like a very few that remain. So I don't know. Maybe we'll make people arm wrestle for them or something. I don't know. I think we're definitely like under 20.
Okay.
Yeah, we've certainly seen them fly off the shelves.
Okay. So next Sunday could be the last Sunday that those are available.
All
right. But they are on Amazon, and miraculously they're a pretty good price. So we can
considering what they are.
Yeah.
I mean, it's literally like a work of art.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely something I'm proud that we're able to kind of make available to our church. That not only allows us to do this as a community, but ultimately allows the individual to go deeper in their journey in this, because my heart's desire has always been that the conversation doesn't begin and end on Sunday. Like, ultimately, I feel the responsibility that I often carry when I'm going on platform is, like, I'm going to do my best to contextualize and lay things out, but the goal is for you to continue it. And so I think this journal helps with that.
When did that start for you personally? Like, maybe we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but continuing from Sunday, was it just a hunger, like I need to know more, or was it someone who just encouraged you, like, hey, here's a way to get more? When did that start for you as a believer?
Man, I'll keep this as succinct as possible. It started for me in the very beginning of my faith journey, and primarily because I've shared this on platform, but all of my friends at the time that I surrendered my life to Christ had different belief systems. Like, our community of friends was Corinth. Like, we had agnostic, we had atheists, we had everything in our mix. So when I have this radical encounter with God and I change my life, like, hey, this is the journey I'm on, I just remember, like, for lack of better words, being interrogated. And I was raised as a Christian, but obviously I couldn't answer questions. I was just like, hey, this is how I was raised. And so I think probably like 3 weeks into going to church 3 weeks in a row, which as an adult was completely unheard of for me. I remember talking with the pastor and saying, like, man, I just have so many questions. And then he just said, hey, why don't you just go back and write notes from the sermon? And when I make scripture references, read through the scripture references. And that started it for me. So I would literally just go back. I would buy the tapes back when actually you would buy tapes. I would buy the tapes of the sermon, and then I would listen to the sermons. And when he's referencing things, I would go back and I would read the entire chapter. And that was my thing of record. And so it gave me so much context, and it gave me more confidence in what I believed. Because, like, the thing about our faith that I love, but that's also challenging, is that everyone's at a different place of development when they're sitting in the seats.
Right.
So as a communicator, you're trying your best to give enough information for the person that may be completely unfamiliar, but you're also aware of the person that's been walking with God for 50 years, and they're like, yeah, man, get to the good stuff. So you're trying your best to weave it all together. And so in that, we trust God, but there's a responsibility that I believe that has to take place on both sides. Like, as the person sitting in the seats, at some point, you have to pursue this on your own. And I'm simply here as a guide to kind of help stoke some curiosity, maybe answer some questions, but we have to continue the conversation.
Yeah, that's a lost art, I feel like, today, is the process, right? The process of being a disciple, because there's masterclass this and learn this in 5 minutes, or here's, 12 steps to being able to understand the Bible. And I think to some extent those are good kickstarters or good catalysts for our walk. But, if we're not looking at the lifetime view of things, we're going to get easily frustrated, number one. And number two, we may even give up. So
Absolutely. I think that's why I've learned, especially now that I'm getting a little bit older, I'm just loving to listen to and like read literature from guys who've been walking with God for like 30, 50 years. Like, there's something about just people who just been walking with God faithfully. So one of my go-to people is Eugene Peterson, and he has this incredible book, or a statement that he makes, called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. I think he has a book on it as well. But it's just basically just, what does it look like to walk faithfully with God year after year after year? And I know in our modern culture, kind of like what you alluded to, that's so unheard of. Just give me the 3 steps that gets me there overnight. But what about a long obedience in the same direction? We're just going to walk with God, and we're going to trust him. We're going to suffer. We're going to cry. We're going to grieve. We're going to keep moving forward. I think that's a life that's lived well, instead of the quick way I can get there, because I think sometimes there's shortcuts out of pain, but it will catch up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if we don't have the theological and relational depth with God to wrestle with those things and sit in it, then we could feel God forsaken, and I think we lose hope.
The series, the Corinth series, was birthed out of an actual trip that you took to Greece. Can you maybe touch on that and why? Because I know when you came back, you were stoked about this idea. What sparked that idea for you to say, hey, we need to go through this study as a church, and it needs to be in depth, and it needs to be elongated. We need to spend some time in it.
Well, I think the short version is, yes, I went to Greece last year, Megan and I, and it was a part of our study abroad program. And so the framework of us going is we go to a Christian university, and we're almost done, praise the Lord. But the framework is a Christian university, and the whole point of the course was to familiarize yourself with different cultures and nuances, so that even whether it's as a clinician in the therapeutic space, or even as a person who's just walking alongside God and you're trying to be sensitive to what people are walking through, just be mindful that everything is in black and white. So when we go to Corinth and you begin to read these passages of scripture, and honestly, up until this point, I would read Corinth as, this is Paul's corrective letter. This church was a hot mess, and Paul's coming in and bringing order. But actually physically being there and understanding the culture, the people, all the different religions and all the stuff that was there that was bleeding into the church, it's like it gave me a lot more empathy and understanding of how they had got to that point, whereas before I just didn't have that. So that was a part of it. But I think there were 2 moments when it really hit me, after kind of like walking and seeing like the literal places that Paul was, places that he alluded to in the book of Acts. And there's one that I referenced in our sermon called the Bema Seat, where when he was accused of basically turning the city upside down and causing chaos, the Bema Seat was this very visible like structure. And ultimately what would happen is all trials were public. And so the way that the city is set up, you would see a person like on this altar stood up trying to make a defense on why they don't need to be executed or excommunicated. So it was a very visible thing, and everybody's kind of sitting beneath, and people are walking by like they're watching a play with this person pleading for why they shouldn't deal with the punishment. And they just gave me this deep conviction of like right before that happened, Paul had a visitation from an angel that said like, hey, nothing's going to happen to you. Keep preaching the gospel. Don't turn your back on it. Trust me. Next day he's arrested. He's standing on a platform and they're like, what, like his life is in jeopardy. And so I don't know what it was about that moment that just when he talks about like, I'm unashamed, it just gave the Bible a different weight of like, he's not doing this in a quiet room. Like this is a very visible thing that he took a stand on. And I think the other moment was the moment that he leaves Corinth. So there's this moment when he leaves Corinth, he shaves off his hair, and then him and Priscilla and Aquila, they leave Corinth. And we literally go to the spot where they all are there. They cry. You see, like, we don't see the ship, but you see the church that was assembled there and where they believe he sailed off from. And it was so serene and so beautiful, but he left because ultimately he was being rejected. So there was something about seeing what Paul went through that gave me a deeper empathy for him, but also empathy for the community. And so I don't know when it registered with me, but I'm like, I just feel a need to tell the story that we live in a culture where some people are ashamed to preach the gospel because they're afraid of the consequences. The other side of the coin is we're often critiquing the influence of culture in the church, but I don't think everything is black and white. There's so many nuances to it. And so I just wanted to tell the story so that we can have more empathy towards one another. It doesn't change what God's truth says, but I think it can produce a little bit more grace and empathy when we understand that even in the nuances of Paul correcting his church, that it was done with love and it was done in a way that still pointed to Jesus, but it was done with sacrifice as well. So that's my best way that I can summarize it, but it was very meaningful for me.
Yeah, that's helpful. When you say that Paul was being rejected, was he being rejected by the church or just the citizens of the city overall? What was the circumstance there?
Both. So initially, when he was there with the church community as it was being established, those who were being drawn to the gospel message, they love Paul. Okay, he's great. He's bringing this message of unification. He's showing us value and purpose, belonging. People who were part of lower caste systems were being treated with equality, which that didn't exist anywhere else.
Right.
Like you were pretty much what you were is what you were. So now you have this guy coming in. Let's share a meal together with slaves and freedmen and prostitutes. Like, so he's really creating this movement that people felt amazed by. So they loved him from that standpoint. Now, the religious people, particularly the Jewish religious folks, they began to feel some type of way because they were seeing Jews shift over. And so they were thinking that, hey, this is just another person who's sowing seeds of a false doctrine. He needs to get out of here. So he was being rejected by the religious elite. When he leaves and he goes on with the rest of his missionary journeys, and then he hears about how the chaos in the city begins to work its way into the church. One, because, you know, it's a story. I like to say it this way. The children of Israel were in the wilderness for 40 years, and the goal was to get Egypt out of them. Egypt is still in all of us. So it's just the sanctification process. Yeah. So when Paul left, the Egypt or the godless part started kind of rising up again. And that's when you start to see some of the chaos that we'll talk about in the coming weeks. So when Paul writes the letter saying like, hey guys, what's going on? Like, this isn't what we talked about. That's when then the church began to reject him. That's when they began to challenge his authority. So you'll see him speaking a lot to his authority in 2 Corinthians because he was being challenged because other apostles were coming in, and you would have Peter who showed up and they're like, well, he really walked with Jesus, so we're going to rock with him. And then you would see other people show up like, well, he's a better communicator. So Paul had to verify like, no, I was called by God. So even though he weaves that in, in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, he really drills down on the fact that, no, I'm called. I was called to do this. But again, it makes my heart break because like you're simply trying to do what God called you to do. And you're trying to build and you're trying to move things forward. And people are like, yeah, but who are you to tell us what to do? So that was kind of the tone of 2 Corinthians. So he was rejected by the culture, but eventually he was rejected by the church.
Yeah, the empathy that you're talking about that you experienced just by being in the historical setting, let's now compare that to actually being where we are in this point in time in history. Does that, and I'm assuming your answer is yes, does that extend to the American church now? Do you have a different appreciation or a different understanding or different approach to how you're viewing the church after this experience? And I know you've been talking a lot about, even leading up to this and even on Sunday, about the similarities between the two cultures. So that's a little bit of a loaded question. So backing up here, what are the similarities between Corinth and we'll just call it the Western church now because that's where we are. I can't speak to anything else.
Yeah.
And then what is your empathetic, or how are you trying to approach maybe some of those issues that are similar to what was being written in 1 Corinthians?
That's a great question. I don't think I really consider that. I would say first, the similarities are pretty much bar for bar, theme for theme. So you have division, which was a major part of it. Then you had doctrinal debates. What is the gifts of the Spirit? You have what role do women play in ministry? So some of these same things that we've seen, what is the role of a husband and wife? What is sexuality? And what are the boundaries on it, or if any? So again, I think the things that we've seen then and the stuff that we plan on addressing in the series are virtually identical to what we're seeing in culture now. So I would say theme for theme, it's pretty much identical in the sense of like what was happening then, what's happening now. It happened in the Eastern church. It just works its way over. I remember several years ago, I spent some time in London, and I was informed that ultimately the Western church is typically 20 years behind whatever's happening in the church over in Europe and in the East. And so they pretty much predicted that, say, hey, and this was probably about 15 years ago, they were like, there's going to come a time when, and they began to outline some of the struggles that they were kind of wrapping up. They like, hey, this is going to hit the American church. And I was like, I don't see that happening. And bro, we're sitting right in the middle of it. Political influences, all those things, they've always kind of been here, but the way that they are so present now is a lot more evident. Now, our dynamics are a little bit more unique because we vote for our leaders and there's systems and structures and things like that. And so it's a little bit different from other churches in the sense that we've attached our ideology and we've kind of woven it in. So that's a little bit unique, but it still has a very similar expression when it comes down to placing our hope in certain leaders and systems that may help one, but not necessarily the other. So that's similar. That we'll be getting into. The second part, the empathy part, man, that's actually a great question. And I think that as I ponder it, I suspect that I will need to be mindful of that, just being completely honest, because I think over the years, what I have experienced is a great deal of frustration when I look at the Western church. And what I mean by that is like how I feel like at times we've gotten off mission and I see the division. And my personal context is spending many years at like my past probably about 18 years in ministry has been in very diverse churches. And it's something that I think that God has really allowed us to walk through, diverse in every essence of it, socioeconomic, ethnic, culturally, politically. And I've been witness to these beautiful movements. But I would say over the past 8 years or so, I've just seen it degrade more and more where it becomes more challenging, specifically with social issues and things like that. And it just didn't used to be that way. So I do find that my personal frustration is how I've seen things kind of drift apart.
Yeah.
So I find myself being more frustrated and critical of allowing ourselves to get there. But I think, to your point, that empathy is still needed with understanding how did we get here. But I recognize it as it's, for me, I think I bypassed the policies and the people, and I see the spiritual division behind it. And I think that's what I find myself more fired up about. It's like, man, like it's almost like the scene in the Garden of Eden when God is kind of like talking with Adam and Eve, like, yo, like what's going on? And they're talking, and of course Adam blames Eve, but then Eve's like, no, but the serpent did it. And even though it looks like scapegoating a little bit, there are moments when I see that we're so busy pointing a finger back and forth that we of a church, we forgot that the serpent was the one that's in the middle of all of this in the first place. So I think that's where my frustration comes the most, is that we're so busy fighting about policies and different ideology things that we've missed sight that, hey, there's a serpent that's been causing all of this, and we're not even making an effort to recognize that that's the source of the problem.
Yeah, it's almost, the scene where Jesus he's weeping over the city. He's like, there's sheep without a shepherd. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. I feel a sense of that even. And I guess you're right. That can turn to frustration. Like, guys, what are we doing? We're missing the whole. So I can definitely see that. You open the can of worms, not me. Let's talk about politics a little bit.
Okay, let's do it.
Well, we touched on this in a series earlier in the year with Reclaim. But how does politics? Well, let's go back to what you said a few seconds ago. Was how did we get here? And again, we kind of touched on this in Reclaim a little bit, but you mentioned, what are we, 3 months out from the election here in America? Because we do have global listeners.
Yes.
So, which I'm sure most of them are aware of what's happening here. But yeah, how did we get here? How did the church become influenced by what's happening in the political sphere? Have we always been influenced to some extent? Is it to a higher degree, or is it our perception of that? You even mentioned, like, hey, we're going to be okay, in your sermon the other day. We're not being, burned at the stake here, at least not yet. So,
not yet, yes.
So yeah, what's your take, or maybe even your vantage point from your years in ministry on how we did get here?
I think, I saw, I'm at a point now where I'm trying to be mindful of where I consume information from, because everybody has a slant.
Sure.
So to the best of my remembrance, I know that there's, like, several decades ago, there was this think tank group that ultimately came out and was beginning to kind of posture at the idea that America needed to be governed with Christian values. And this is going back decades and decades ago. And so that's when you began to kind of see, like, a very staunch line being drawn between, like, Christian values and what were the Christian values, and then what party was going to grab a hold of those Christian values. So that kind of became like the running language of, hey, we have Christian values, which means the other people obviously don't have any Christian values. So that kind of created it. And it was very soft at the time. But what I've noticed over the years as it's progressively moved forward, I think the ideological difference that we're beginning to see more prominent is that, we've always heard, at least from the time I can remember being in school, at least from what I can remember when I paid attention, was like, hey, there's a separation between church and state.
Right.
This idea, like, hey, let's keep these things separate. And those things, it's hard to do because it bleeds over in weird ways. Like I remember, like having moments of silence and prayer. Like, so it was there, but it was also not dictated, but it was there. Yeah. And so you kind of have that part of it. Then you got to a point where, like, hey, let's have a true separation of church and state. Let's make sure that we keep, like, the things that are happening in society, particularly like schools and other public places. Like, let's genuinely be mindful that there may be people who don't share the same beliefs as you. You kind of run that down the field a little bit. Culture is beginning to evolve and do what culture does, which is the result of people who don't have a relationship with God. And so what you begin to find is that you have some Christians that have the belief system that says, like, hey, America needs to be governed with Christian values. So let's vote for people. Let's put laws in place. Let's put things in place that allows us to be governed with Christian values. So now you have a country that has people that are saying, hey, but I'm not a Christian. Or maybe I don't want you to legislate what my day-to-day life looks like and what it looks like for me to make decisions with my body, all those things. So I think that's where you begin to see this big divide, where I think ultimately it comes down to, should our country be governed with Christian values or not? So I would say, for the sake of just when you're, for me, I recognize that as an American citizen and the idea of what America is supposed to be, it's a place of freedom. So I find myself running through this lid of like, okay, like any time that I've seen laws enforced that were connected to a belief system, it was always oppressive. There's never been a culture that it's not been. Go over to Saudi Arabia, like that's just but wherever you go, look at the Roman culture, it was always oppressive. And so it makes me think about when Jesus was doing his thing and they take him and they're like, hey, we're going to make him king by force. Jesus said, no, I don't want that. And he literally disappeared out of the city. So I think that, yes, we want to have a world that is filled with peace, love. But I think that what we're finding now is that you have some people that believe the way that we do that is by putting laws in place and governing it that way. And then you have other people who believe, no, we win them to Christ and allow them to live a life that makes it possible. So that's where I see the biggest shift when you have like conservative versus progressive Christians is that. I think my position when it comes to looking at the world, again, this is looking at the world, I am not surprised that the world is the world. Mm-hmm. I don't go into any venue that is not a Christian venue and expect it to uphold my beliefs. Mm-hmm. So I think the thing that surprises me is that we are surprised if we go into a store or if we watch TV and we see something that doesn't necessarily support us. I'm like, yeah, they never said they were going to. Like,
right.
They're not Christian, so why are we expecting it? And so I think people's response to that is kind of what's setting the tone for what we're seeing a lot in society.
Yeah, I was talking to a pastor when I was over in Zimbabwe, and he was just asking, what's the state of the church in America? And my first response is, well, it's lukewarm. But we can talk about Revelation another day.
Yeah, we're going to get to it. I wanted to do a series on it. It's coming 2025.
And then someone else in the car was just like, it's very politicized, or things have become political, and whether the country has become involved in the church or the church has become involved in the country, I'm not here to argue that. But yeah, and then I started to think through that, and I even started to talk to him about even the country, the history and the founding of the nation. And I was like, a lot of people assumed that we are a Christian nation because of some of the rhetoric used in founding the country. But when I look at even some of those founders, they're not necessarily Christian.
They weren't Christians, yeah.
They're the Jefferson Bible isn't the Bible. There were things that he didn't like about it. Yes. We would consider him a founding father. Benjamin Franklin, I don't think, what was held Judeo-Christian beliefs. I think in the time period, it was a little bit more acceptable to talk about God in the sense that we may refer to him nowadays. So I think that's why we see some of that language and maybe even some of those traditions, like a National Day of Prayer or, God Bless America song, those types of things.
Well said.
So I think that's where we see it. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused and will point to that and say, well, we're a Christian nation. And I don't necessarily know if that's the case. I think there are Judeo-Christian values that are kind of weaved into the fabric of how we were founded.
Absolutely.
But the whole point, one of the main pillars of the founding of the country was just religious freedom in general.
Yes.
And like you said, not making laws that were oppressive, especially to those who were religious.
I think, man, you summarize it brilliantly. And I think that's the tension.
Yeah.
So when people are often talking about like getting back to a moment when our nation was great or whatever that looks like, I think that means something different for everybody. So I think we just have to be mindful that for some people it's never been that. and then also recognizing that when you look at the influence of, when you look at Christian history, and I've never thought that I would be a person who's into like history.
Yeah.
Like I just never thought I would be into it, but I find myself more intrigued by it because the more that I'm studying history with scripture, the more that it's pointing to culture. And I'm like,
That looks familiar.
Yeah, that looks familiar. Let me, like, so it's drawing me in on things I just never thought that I
Nice.
would. But what I'm seeing is that the way that Christianity was spread, which again, like, talk about the Crusades, forcing people, like, at the expense of their lives if they didn't, like, that mentality, forcing people into being baptized and all those things, that was so pervasive. And so even when you look at the way that the faith, quote unquote, grew with these massive conversions, and then these same people were governing different countries, and then you have America being birthed, like, all of those things are bleeding through. So yes, while people were trying to escape oppression and religion, that was so much of a formation of the way that they thought. It wove its way into just some of the way that we approach things anyway. But I would honestly say it's almost like when you're reading literature, reading scripture, and trying your best to understand the author's intent. I don't believe the author's intent was, hey, we're going to be a Christian nation. Because I think, to the point that you've made, when you understand why they even sought to break free from and what they were looking to accomplish, it was to establish a place of freedom, not a place of control.
Yeah. Everybody is going to love that segment. Anyways, so 1 Corinthians even speaks to a little bit about what you just mentioned. And, verse 20 says, "Where's the wise person? Where's the teacher of the law? Where's the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what we preach to save those who believe."
Yes.
So, case in point right there, like, God's ways are not the world's ways, and they look foolish to the world, or they look foolish to us until we have the revelation of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, So I think case in point to, we can't be surprised because the gospel does look foolish.
Absolutely.
There's a guy who died, and
Right.
supposedly it's supposed to secure my eternal destiny because some Jewish guy died for me.
Yes.
Apparently, what if I didn't want him to?
Right.
That looks foolish.
It seems ridiculous when you honestly, like, we pick and choose, but if we honestly were to break down our faith from just a simple, logical way, it doesn't make sense. In the same way that when I examine certain aspects of other belief systems, there's a moment where it hits a wall where I'm like, okay, this is beyond me. It just doesn't make any sense. And I can name a list of them. We all have a moment where that revelation has to we have to have this encounter, this divine revelation that we would honestly believe is the Holy Spirit enlightening us and making us aware of our own sin nature and our inability to save ourselves, and who Jesus is and what that meant for us. Like, that doesn't make sense. 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2 in that equation.
Yeah.
So
in that case, to get to the unity that we so desperately desire, I guess what should be our expectation of unity? I think you touched on it a little bit on Sunday, but again, how do we even get unified in what unity looks like? Number one, you know, and then what are the steps that we need to take? Because you did mention in your first point on Sunday that unity is not uniformity. So if we're trying to all look the same or act the same or even hold the same thought patterns, we're probably not going to get there. So that could be a losing battle, which, again, some countries have tried to do, and that is never a good thing either. So how do we become, to the best of your ability, explain, how do we truly become unified under the name of Jesus while at the same time embracing our different aspects or our wide array of diversity?
I think it would require us to, because I feel like for Christians that are genuinely trying to do the best they can, that they genuinely are just saying, hey, I just want to live a godly life, and I want my family to live a godly life, and I want to see us thrive in the way that God intended, and I want to live in a world, in an ecosystem that allows for that. I'm 1,000% on board with that. But I think we often can miss in pursuit of that. We then look to leaders that kind of promise, like, hey, if I'm in office, I can create that for you. And again, policies are great, but again, we just have to be mindful of if we're trying to legislate something that only God can really do. But that's a whole nother side point. I believe what it requires us to do is to really examine the early church and examine even Jewish history, which is where our faith is birthed out of, because what you will find is there was nuance. And Nate, I was probably about 10 years into my walk with God before I realized that even in the Jewish context, even in the early church context, there were spaces where they didn't agree on everything. And so you would see that people would say, like, let's go back and looking at like how you would have different rabbis.
Mm-hmm.
Some rabbis would say, hey, when I look at the creation story, I think of that as a literal 7 days. And you have another rabbi that would say, hey, when I look at that, I look at it as more of a story that's telling the story of God and his creation, but I don't look at it as literally. So they would talk about it. They would sometimes debate about it. They would walk away and they would still continue to be friends. I think we've lost the ability to have nuance where it's okay that if we come to a different conclusion, as long as at the end of the day, both men are saying, but we believe that God is a creator.
Mm-hmm.
So how we get there may look different, but that's okay. I think we need to go back to our roots and begin to recognize that's how the early church was. Like they were trying their best to figure it out. And sometimes I find myself when I read the scriptures and I see like moments where I love the Bible because the Bible doesn't protect, they don't protect our leaders from their flaws. Like it puts it all out there. So they're arguing, they're debating, they're trying to figure out what do we do with Gentiles? Like they're just trying to figure it out and they're capturing all of it. And they're like, hey, listen, how about we just make sure like, hey, if you're not Jewish, you don't have to get circumcised. Like y'all good with that? Cool. What else y'all think? Like it's literally them just trying their best being led by the Spirit. But you see this space of, hey, let's just have a couple of non-negotiables and everything else, man, let's just keep our hands open because we're all trying to figure this out. We've completely lost that. We feel like, hey, if you have, not only do you have to believe that Jesus is Lord, but you have to believe in these other 8 things too in order for us to find common ground. And I think that's where it gets lost. Now, that's more on the theological standpoint.
Okay.
If we roll over to a cultural side of things, I think that what I recognize and witness a lot in our world now is the inability to show empathy for others. And so I think that's something that if we can really submit that to the cross, it's similar to what I said in my third point about like, man, like it's okay. Like with my granddaughter's it's one's birthday and the other one's not. It's okay for me to celebrate one and not the other. And it doesn't say anything about me being any less than. I feel like we can truly experience unity when I can show empathy to you and it doesn't in any way dehumanize me. So what I'm noticing now, whenever there's like a tragedy, you take things that are happening in society, whether there's a mass shooting or there's something that happens with an individual, and we know the sensitivities that are in our culture. When someone is talking about it, someone feels the need to try to undermine it, and they try to minimize it. When what it looked like as Christians, we were like, hey man, I can't even imagine what that is. But man, the Bible tells me to bear one another's burdens. That's not a burden that I have, but I'm gonna walk alongside you and connect with you and be encouraged with you, man. When we were talking about back in 2020, when we're already dealing with a pandemic, but there's a lot of racial tension that was going on. The amount of people, the amount of my white friends that have reached out to me and like, hey man, like, I don't know what this looks like. I don't even know everything that led up to it, but I do understand that this is not a good look. I understand that there are people in our African American community that are suffering, that don't feel safe. I don't know the answer to it. I didn't cause it. But bro, I just want to let you know I'm here for you and I'm sorry. And if there's anything I can do, bro, that went so far. Like at first I was like, why do you keep calling me? Like, but then I got to a point I'm like, oh man, that's just, hey, I'm going to bear the burden with you because I know that maybe you feel some way about it. Like that's beautiful. I feel like there was a moment when we did it because society was like, well, you have to do it. If not, you get canceled. But I think if we could do that from a true place of purity of like, hey, whether the camera's on or not, I understand that this is a sensitive subject and I just want to walk alongside and show empathy. That's how we can begin to walk in unity where I don't feel like I have to invalidate your pain.
Yeah, and even asking questions, being curious, having a genuine curiosity to understand whether it be, racially or theologically. Like, I think we're already developing our argument before we've even heard what the other person has to say. And that can be dangerous, and it could it could impede your personal development as well. And I heard somebody say, you know, one of the greatest characteristics of humility is realizing that I could be wrong. You know, just I could have something to learn from you, whether you're 5 years old or 55.
1000%.
You know, like there's wisdom in being able to learn from all different groups of people, and diverse ways of thinking. One of my last questions, if not the last question here, is the role of social media and how it's exacerbated perhaps the division, for lack of a better word, or maybe that is the right word, but it's no doubt influenced us, you know, on a massive scale, and it's interrupted our ability to be able to do this without cameras and microphones, right?
Yep.
So if you're modern day Apostle Paul, are you addressing this at all? Like how do you address it in a way that's constructive, in a way that's edifying to the church, but in a way that doesn't say, hey, you can't have social media?
Yeah. Man, I think that's such a challenging thing, because there's a lot of times where people like will read scriptures, will take what we know about Paul or Jesus or the disciples and say, well, they would never.
Got it.
Like Jesus would never get on an airplane. I don't know if I agree with that. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's always like these, like, cause ultimately we're projecting what someone should and shouldn't do, and we're reading into it. So
yeah, you're right.
So we just don't know. I think this is a vehicle that's there. And I look at social media like money. It's amoral. It could be used to build a church and help people. It could also be used to fund sex trafficking. It's amoral. So I think that's what social media is. It's a tool that can inform and encourage. And I know for me, when I first got on it, it was, man, I'm seeing cousins' pictures of their kids that we live, like it was intended to that. When it began to evolve into like social media in a sense of like the politics and all the other social things, the gotcha things, I recognized, I think a couple of years ago, I watched this documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, and it messed me up, because what it does is it shows you the algorithms behind the system that fuels engagement. So literally, this is the thing that I think is like, I'm not the man's out to get you type guy. That's not really my temperament. But honestly, there's algorithms that are out there, and they're trying to find ways to keep you engaged, because there's advertising dollars that are attached to your engagement. Everything is connected. So ultimately, there's like algorithms that are say like, hey, we've noticed that Nate hasn't been on in 3 days. Let's make sure when he logs on, we're going to have things on there that he typically likes to engage in that will ultimately, hopefully, stimulate him to engage more. Like, it is all psychology at the darkest form. So when I look at it from that lens, I think that my biggest caution, and what I truly believe that the Apostle Paul would say, is something that I'll probably will address maybe this upcoming Sunday, is when he's talking to the Corinthian church. He's like, man, you guys have a lot of teachers, but you don't have a lot of fathers. You're getting a lot of information, but who's literally shepherding you through it? I would say that what Paul's critique would be like, man, we're consuming information at a rate that I think is kind of unhealthy. It's not even being vetted anymore. We're jumping to conclusions, and we've already filled in gaps with narratives that may not even be rooted in truth. And it's so hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube once it's out. So I think what Paul would probably encourage people to do is like, use that same resources to uplift, to build, to promote something encouraging, but then also recognizing the same biblical principles that were there, that were meant to address, hey, when someone has sinned against you, have a conversation with them. How about we not do that on social media? Like, so let's use social media the same way that the gospel was supposed to be presented. When we do have conflict, let's have individual conversations instead of airing it out and creating hypothetical dialogues that only continue to perpetuate the division, because those algorithms are ultimately going to create an echo chamber where you're going to hear and see the stuff that you're interested in, and it just continues to fuel it, and we don't even realize that we don't even know if the opinion that we have is because we came to it on our own or because some algorithm recognized that we respond to certain things and it's been fed to us so much that we don't even recognize if it's how I really feel or if I have been led to feel that way. We're in the Matrix, man.
Unplug.
Yes.
Which kind of leads into what I believe to be the solution is what you're going to talk about from what I asked you, 45 minutes ago, what week 2 is about, cruciformity.
Yeah.
And how about I crucify my opinion?
Yes.
You know what I mean? How about I stop elevating my opinion or my viewpoint above the cross? And you even mentioned it a little bit this past Sunday is putting anything before even the word Christian. You've already kind of lost that battle, right?
Yep.
So
you've already made an idol of it.
Yeah, a little teaser into week 2 before we head out here, Pastor Keith. Do you mind?
So I'll probably flesh that out a little bit more. I know. I think in one service I mentioned that phrasing of like the cross and anything we put in front of it. This week I'll probably expound on that a lot more.
Great.
And you referenced the phrase cruciformity, living a cruciformed life. And that is a life that has been formed because of the crucifixion, which is a surrendered life, a life of sacrifice. And so that's what I'm excited to kind of get into is really like we can have convictions, we can have opinions, but can we submit them to the cross and not put it in front of the cross? And that changes everything. It changes the way that not the way that just I view my neighbor. It could potentially even change the way, get ready for this, that I vote. Because think about this, and this is something I've been wrestling with. So much of what we see in this political system and in the way that things are being fed to us is you have to make decisions that are best for you. I have to have policies that are best for me. But if I'm living a cruciform life, what if, man, I'm good, but there's somebody else that could benefit for something a little bit different? That's all I'll say.
That's not controversial. You guys are going to love this new season of After the Message, and we're going to love it too. Make sure you guys stay tuned to what we got going on here at Celebration Church. You can follow us on social media, obviously, liking, subscribing, so that you can get kind of notifications on when the next episode's going to be. But Pastor Keith, thanks so much for joining us today, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
It's going to be good, man. I'm excited. And listen, we love everybody.
Yeah, of course.
I want to be very clear.
Yeah, of course.
I'm kingdom.
Yeah.
But we have to address these things in the kingdom way so that way we can begin to get healed up and get that unity we're talking about.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it, brother.
Come on, man. Let's do it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. To learn more about Celebration Orlando, a church devoted to reaching the lost, equipping the found, and helping the hurting, follow us on social media using the handle @CelebrationORL or visit our website celebrationorl.org.